we've taken that infrastructure provided by nature for granted. We haven't really valued it until, in some senses, we've lost it.
Welcome back to Infrastructure Connections. Today we're speaking with David Carter, and he's going to explain to us what is natural infrastructure, how can natural infrastructure and our gray infrastructure work together to create a world that we want to live in, and how do we bring back nature so that it's a place we get to enjoy. David is the executive chair of Beca and director of Meridian Energy. He's also a guardian for the Aotearoa Circle and chair of the University of Auckland Foundation. He has a doctorate in geotechnical engineering from UC Berkeley, and David was the winner of the Outstanding Leadership and Contribution to Infrastructure Award at Building Nations 2024. Hi, David. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
You grew up on the water, and I'm just curious what you've seen over the years, especially when it comes to the environment that you saw when you were growing up and what's happening there now.
Excellent. Look, I've had a really fortunate life. I was born into a family that lived on the sea, loved the sea. As a consequence, I've been on and around boats all of my life. The Waitemata, up and down the coastline of northern New Zealand and sailed overseas. I have very vivid memories. The Great Barrier Island holds a very special place for me. And I can still remember snorkeling for crayfish under Wellington Head at Great Barrier Island, and memories of lines, maybe kilometres, that might be a childhood memory, but lines of gannets diving off its inside shores. And those gannets still exist, but in much smaller pockets, and crayfish now functionally extinct within the Hauraki Gulf. And so while everything looks, shimmering and from the surface, beneath the surface, a very different state.
Yeah, I took place in the diving to count the crayfish off of Waiheke Island last year, and the numbers we were seeing were, I didn't even spot one while I was out there, and everybody else counted, one or two. It was pretty sad.
There was something like 600 to 1,500 square kilometres of mussel beds across the Firth of Thames and the broader Hauraki Gulf. And that change is immeasurable. We took those mussel beds partly for food, partly for fertiliser, and over 4,000 of New Zealand's indigenous species are currently listed as threatened or at risk. So, part of it is, as a nation, we kind of think we're in great shape in the nature perspective, but in reality, the level of degradation that's happened over time, and I'm not forlorn about it because I genuinely believe we can, return that. Those mussel beds, and it goes to this conversation about infrastructure, right? Those mussel beds were estimated to have filtered all the water in the Firth of Thames within a day, the whole Firth of Thames. Wow. To try and do that mechanically is just practically an impossibility. So we don't, we've taken that infrastructure provided by nature for granted. We haven't really valued it until, in some senses, we've lost it. And there are parts of New Zealand where that isn't the case. But I think there's something foundational, fundamental to be able to go out and secure kai moana, and it's absolutely possible. But we've decimated parts of our coastline.
Yeah. What do you think we'll be doing in order to try to help make that happen again?
Well, I think I was sitting talking to a number of parties the other day, and you almost get that sense of hopelessness. But they were talking about fascinating things like using robotics that clean the legs of offshore oil and gas platforms, and they've been experimenting with them in the Hauraki Gulf about how you remove kinna barrens and allow kelp forests to regrow. I'm probably a believer in very large marine parks, not to the exclusion of stopping removing your ability to take fish out of the Gulf, certainly within those marine parks, absolutely not. But because I believe if you provide those environments within nature to prosper, then automatically those fish, that sea life will go outside those parks, and then we have this dichotomy where we're not prepared to stop for long enough to allow natural systems to restore.
I would like to see that expanded, those parks expanded, definitely, so that the wildlife in them has a chance to leave without being caught. Yeah. So you've been very vocal about nature and about sustainability. Was there a moment sometime in your career when sustainability suddenly made sense? Was there an aha moment or kind of a gradual dawning of realization that this was important to you?
I don't know there was an aha moment. I think I'd like to think, or I certainly feel, a real affinity with nature. Probably the two events that stand out for me that sort of live on vividly in my memory were both around Project Manukau, which was a project that set out to replace the 400 to 500 hectares of wastewater treatment ponds that sat on the shore of the Manukau harbour with on-land mechanical treatment, and then return those ponds to the harbour itself. And it involved a phenomenal amount of work. We did 13 kilometres of foreshore restoration. We built bird roosts in the harbour. But the moment that stood out to me is we got to the culmination of that project. We'd dredged up all the sediment that had been left on the bottom of those ponds. And the final day came when we stood out on the end of the bund with some large diggers to sever that bund and basically allow the harbour back into that area of waterway. And you do it on an outgoing tide so you can get a decent hole going before the tide turns around and starts coming in. And we were there. I was there for the dawn blessing. And the kaumātua on that bund were in tears because they never thought in their lifetime they would see the waters of the Manukau harbour return to their foreshore of their marae. And I didn't have that attachment to nature. I loved nature, but not to the sense that it was just part of me. I was part of it. And I think the second thing that stood out in that is, there'd been a huge amount of debate around whether the level of cleanliness, that the cleanup that we'd done inside those ponds was good enough that nature could get hold back again. And within one tide, that foreshore had invertebrates all over it.
Wow.
And what I mean by that, well, the lesson that taught me was, if you give nature a sniff, if you give it the slightest chance, if you give it a little bit of help, it's away.
That's a great example of where you're regenerating biodiversity. Where do you see us taking that now today?
I think we've got ourselves into this mindset where we kind of go, if we're going to be economically prosperous, we have to do that at the consequence of nature. Degradation of nature is the automatic, inevitable consequence of that prosperity. We kind of see them as mutually exclusive, and I just fundamentally disagree with that. In fact, I would say to you that our prosperity as a nation relies on nature, and therefore thriving ecosystems will only promote it. So, how we get to that state where we value nature is probably the far more vexing question. May well take multiple parallel work streams, I sense.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic example. I didn't realize those mussel beds were used for agriculture, for fertilizer, for land agriculture. So they're being taken out of the ecosystem of the ocean and put onto the land, and then no longer cleaning the ocean. That's quite an amazing example.
Well, and I think it goes a step further, right? They themselves will then be polluting and increasing the phosphorus, nitrogen in the waterways and putting it back into the further dam. So actually, you get a double whammy.
Right. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into what we want to talk about today. You were part of the Natural Infrastructure Plan Steering Committee, and we are seeing the reintroduction of mussel beds as a form of natural infrastructure. How did you come to be involved in the plan, and what was your role?
Yeah, I've been a guardian on the Aotearoa Circle now for about 4 years. It's a 6-year maximum term. Over that time, I've seen the Circle deliver a really impressive body of work. And in my role as guardian, then I had a governance role for the Natural Infrastructure Plan.
And what is the natural infrastructure plan? What does it advocate? What's its main purpose?
Yeah, look, firstly, in February this year, Te Waihanga, the Infrastructure Commission, launched its latest national infrastructure plan as opposed to natural infrastructure plan. And the purpose of that plan really is to address regional development needs for New Zealand and to guide New Zealand's infrastructure investment over the next 30 years. It's a substantial body of work, absolutely necessary and hugely important. So I take my hat off to them. Probably the one provocation I would have in that is the focus of that plan really is around hard or grey infrastructure solutions. And it's effectively silent on nature and what the natural infrastructure provides. I would say, almost without recognition and on a daily basis. And the mussel bed conversation would be a perfect example of that. I think the other comment I would say is too often we tend to think of nature as being separate to the economy.
Right.
And we tend to regard them in two separate streams. And ultimately, they're an integral part. Our world is a system. It doesn't exist as individual elements. It operates as a system. And therefore, the concept of the natural infrastructure plan certainly wasn't to establish a parallel plan to the national infrastructure plan. Rather, the ask that we had was that in time, natural infrastructure would be recognised and incorporated within that national plan as opposed to sitting outside it. And it's really about recognising that natural infrastructure is a hugely important tool in that infrastructure toolkit. Those natural assets are providing resilience, productivity, intergenerational prosperity, and I think they absolutely fit well within that natural infrastructure plan.
When the plan came out, it was the first time I'd heard of it being called natural infrastructure. Of course, I'd heard of nature-based solutions, but somehow to me, nature-based solutions always seem to be serving human interests as opposed to actually being any good for nature, depending on how they were used. The carbon credits for monocrop trees is a great example. But so to hear about natural infrastructure where the nature is the infrastructure that we're using, where we're not using gray infrastructure anymore. So wetlands, dunes, forests, rivers, coastal habitats, that was just fascinating to me. And so I think the value of the plan is starts with the name and then works its way. It gets even better from there. So what are some of the real world applications of natural infrastructure?
I'm not talking about natural infrastructure completely replacing what we think is hard grey infrastructure. Rather, my concept is that they need to work in concert. Both types are needed. You can understand why pipes provide an immediate solution in the short term, but you also understand why and that potentially new natural infrastructure takes a long time to create. But you can also play that game forward, and in 50 years, you're having to replace pipes, channels, everything else, and yet, forests that you've planted upstream have taken over themselves, and the maintenance costs are a lot less. So, it's about, classic examples. You see it in Wellington recently, about in Auckland, take your hats off to what's happening, but it's about making room for water. It's recognising that we've constrained watercourses, we've constrained floodplains. That works under certain events, but when those events become more extreme, and they are becoming more extreme and more frequent, those hard systems just can't cope, and they need to be working in concert with natural system design, I think is the best way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. We've been seeing quite a few events in the last few years, and it's inevitable that we're going to have worse and worse events. And nature's been dealing with water for so long that it's gotten pretty good at handling the soil and rerouting the water. And so we might as well let it do the work for us.
Well, I think, I think the thing we forget, right, is that what we've ended up with prior to man messing with it is the result of thousands of years of nature playing out in the landscape. And those systems weren't created overnight. They were created by handling all that diverse range of events that got thrown at it. So, And the hillsides that stood up were the ones that had the right type of vegetation on it. So
yeah, and it's like you were saying before, it seems to be an or approach. They're not going to work in tandem. We're going to replace one system with the other. And I think we're finding that we can do that. We have tamed the environment, I guess you could say, but at great cost and a great maintenance requirement. Now this natural infrastructure plan seems to be implementing an and approach.
Yeah. It's about how they work in concept, right? They can both fulfill very different. And the fact is, we've already made substantial changes to our urban environment. We cannot go back to the way it was, and we wouldn't expect to. You can't accommodate cities and people without making significant changes. I think we just need to stop and think, have we gone too far in some areas, and how might we better do it in the future? And we're living the consequence currently of decisions that were made 20, 30, 50 years ago.
Well, that's a good point, too, because nature doesn't grow very fast. And it could take 30 to 50 years to get those forests back, or get those mangroves back, or get those mussels back. How do we manage that transition from gray to green so that we're not exposed in the meantime?
You can put a pipe in tomorrow, which is why I'm talking about working in concept. You can't create a forest tomorrow.
Right.
But you can start creating a forest that will be there to serve in 30, 40, 50 years' time. You can't put back 600 to 1,500 square kilometres of mussel beds tomorrow. But we can start by we could start by learning about how we restore some mussel beds, how we get them to a critical size that then nature can take over and take it the rest of the way. We can't restore crayfish in the Hauraki Gulf tomorrow, but we can start by limiting the take, preventing the take, and introducing marine reserves where they can, the young can grow, get to a certain size, and then inevitably they'll start moving out of those reserves. So I absolutely believe it's possible to get to regenerate nature, and I don't see that at the exclusion of economic prosperity. I see the two of them going hand in hand.
It was interesting to see them actually mirror sort of what the National Infrastructure Plan was saying, because the National Infrastructure Plan really emphasized the need for maintenance and budgeting for maintenance over time to preserve the assets that we have, as opposed to necessarily focusing exclusively on new infrastructure. And so nature does that for us as soon as it's planted, and it takes minimal amount of it doesn't require a great deal of human oversight in order to make sure it's actually maintaining its system. It kind of does that naturally, pun intended. But what I thought one of the things that the plan said was that it demonstrates a financially sound business case for nature-based solutions.
Look, I'll be honest. I also struggle with the concept of valuing nature. And I think part of that is also because so many of those benefits almost seem spiritual. They almost seem foundational, However, everything, in a business world, in a government world, etc., everyone turns around, what's the cost-benefit ratio? What's the return on this investment and other bits and pieces? So I think the practical reality is that in parallel with working people towards understanding that we need to recognize the value that nature is providing. How you define value is an interesting thing. But if we don't provide a mechanism that they can get a certain agreement on around how that is valued, then when we get to the point of convincing people that they need to start valuing nature, then we won't be able to go the next step. And so the idea of coming up with methodologies of how you value nature is to provide, that financial language, I guess, if I want to use that will enable governments, businesses to make more fulsome, longer term apples for apples comparisons.
I guess the good news is that the Natural Infrastructure Plan had made an attempt at translating into those financial benefits, and I actually offered case studies where they showed savings were achieved on real projects as a result. What were some of those financial benefits that projects are seeing just in general?
Oh, look, I think you can reduce CapEx. You made that point before about once you start planting a forest and you've got it to a certain size, the ongoing maintenance and OPEX associated with those forests minimal. We well know, I think the plan said, over 60% of our expenditure in infrastructure needs to go into maintenance of the existing hard assets. That's a cost that we've just underappreciated or underaccounted for over decades, and we're living the consequence of that now in so many areas. And improved insurance premiums. If you have two options. You either get to a point where we try and address some of these issues, or we get to a point where the insurance industry walks away and says we're not going to insure those areas or those things, and that's not good for anybody. And then we get into, hopefully much better consenting, compliance cost. Imagine if we could get to a point which said, this project can go ahead as long as it's net nature positive. Now, that's a very simple statement, and I understand how simplistic that is, because how you define improved net nature positive, and it will be different for everybody, and it's got geographical issues. Is degrading in one rohe acceptable as long as you're getting regeneration in another? But what we do know is a lot of these debates are both causing massive time delays and massive costs in their own right, and therefore, how do we simplify those systems?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Asking if it's nature positive is definitely a valid question, especially when so much of what we're building, whether we're building on a floodplain or recovered land or whatnot, if it's stretching the system so that we need gray infrastructure to repair it, then you question whether it was worth building there in the first place, or if we could build it there in a way that doesn't require that gray infrastructure investment, then that's certainly a win.
Yeah. And we have that information now. Insurance companies collect that information on a daily basis. They can show you exactly where the wrong places are to live. They have the hard data. This isn't esoteric stuff around what the costs are of remaining there and rebuilding versus leaving. And I think, look, we can't throw a switch. As I said before, that we're living the consequences of decisions that were made 10, 20, 50 years ago. But what we can try and do is make sure that we incorporate that thinking into the planning and consenting and urban plans that we're putting out now, so that we don't perpetuate that continuity of problem in another 30 and 50 years that subsequent generations that we know are going to be paying for it. So.
Yeah. Well, what are some of the projects that are happening now?
Oh, look, I think, clearly, the work that's going on around in Auckland at the moment around making room for water, and those hard conversations about people that have houses in areas that need to become floodplains, and actually those houses need to be acquired. We're doing it. The Auckland Airport example, it speaks to me, because for the first 15 years of my career, I spent it in airports building hard stands, runways, and other bits and pieces. If you can, that solution of coming up with a coupled wetland biofilter solution, which took up a third of the space needed and actually provided a much higher level of treatment and allows for flood flows with a cascading level of going out of the wetlands through the biofilter and direct discharge, is an example of how you build something for nature and future-proof future-proof an airport living in that situation. You read the Kaipara Moana example in there, the return on investment, that 4-to-1, even if, and I well appreciate that way of valuing that return will be subject to debate and refinement over time, and we absolutely need to do that. So when people talk about hard numbers, everybody's no longer debating the numbers, but are aligned on what we land on. And Christchurch City, with its development of its southwestern urban area, took that exact approach, but they had enough foresight back in, 1990s, in late 80s, 90s, in that thinking, to actually go away from a traditional pipe-based concrete channel system to actually incorporating flood zones, natural water channels, and those areas, even if they're flooded infrequently, in between massive flood events, they provide great open spaces for nature to regenerate and for people to enjoy, and it just makes the whole subdivision, a whole lot more enjoyable. So there's an example of both saving money, getting another 12,000 homes in an area, and using natural infrastructure to provide a solution that once you'd have been tempted to maximise that area through the use of pipes and channels. So
yeah, well, you see that now with Christchurch there, that river that runs through it, because the floodplains have been left open now, they have these beautiful parks that people can use when it's not flooded. This is a fantastic example.
Isn't it? Isn't that fantastic on a sunny day now in Christchurch? I mean, how Christchurch is rebuilt and along that river and the public spaces, it's just heartwarming.
It's definitely a plus for the city.
Yeah.
But I guess that also gets back to the question of financing, because that's where we always end up with infrastructure, is how we're going to finance it. So Christchurch, when they're financing those parks, obviously they would have to pay for a park, as opposed to, say, if someone's building a subdivision and grey infrastructure needs to go in, that subdivision is going to be providing a contribution to the city to pay for that infrastructure. So how do we, I don't know if there's an answer quite yet, but how do we help fund the nature solutions, the natural infrastructure, through contributions for things that are maybe not being built?
Oh, yeah. Oh, look, you're way out of my expertise and other things. That's something for the economists. My electricity generators, as an example, right? We're heavily reliant on what happens in the catchment upstream. We're reliant on both the catchment downstream because of the impact we have on those catchments and our social license to operate. But if you think about going upstream, if you've got major slips in catchments, if you've got logs coming down rivers, you've got siltation in your dams, you've got to clear out your log screens. So there's a cost with doing that. If you think about some remote wind sites, you've got big access roads to get to those wind sites. You need to keep those access roads open. If your hillsides along those roads are unstable, you're going to have a continual maintenance. And it's about changing some of the thinking from we'll deal with the cost when the event happens, to actually putting a bit of that thinking back into the upstream and going, we know this is going to happen. We know the inevitability of it. If you take, Waka Kotahi and the recovery that we've seen in the S Valley and other bits and pieces, we now know that if the hillsides have exotic forests in the upstream catchments, when they fail and the logs come down the streams, then the bridges are going to go. So we know the impact that's going to happen. We know the cost we're going to have to bear. And it's about redirecting some of that money upstream, solving those problems in advance of them happening, rather than downstream at the bottom of the cliff. And I'm conscious, as we talked before, this is not flicking a switch. This does not happen tomorrow. You can't, particularly since there's larger parts of the economy that rely on those exotic forests and other bits and pieces in the short term. But we need to get towards some longer term thinking of where is that state that we want to end up in, that's a more sustainable state.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things the plan did well as well, was just to point out that it's in business's best interest to have that natural infrastructure in place. As you mentioned, all of those systems, forestry that relies on nature as part of their actual business model, they're also going to have to rely on natural infrastructure in order to resolve some of those problems. The plan said that the bioeconomy delivers 27% of the nation's GDP through food production, wood products, and tourism. And so that's no small portion. And so definitely those organizations are going to be interested in natural infrastructure and how they can assist, and really basically are helping themselves.
Yeah. We talk about nature conservation, and it's almost like it has this implication that we want to stick a fence with barbed wire around the top of it and cordon off a bit of area and protect it from anyone touching it or anyone. I live in I approach it from a different angle. I'm not after nature conservation. I'm after nature regeneration. I'm after flooding our cities with bird life. I'm after, flooding our Gulf with crayfish and fish. I'm not, my concept behind marine parks is not to stop fishing. In fact, I think you'll take more fish out of the Hauraki Gulf and more well, I know you'll take more crayfish out of the Hauraki Gulf because you can't take any now. If we actually are prepared to think long term and put in place measures that cause nature to regenerate, to get it back to a level where we can then decide what is that sustainable level of extraction. Yeah, well, it's like, what was that song, Big Yellow Taxi, which is going, we're putting the trees in a tree museum and we'll charge all the public $1 just to see them. Wouldn't it be fantastic if Kiwis walked across our back lawns and, we had wood pigeons, flying around our houses, and it is absolutely doable. We have enough green space, we have enough parks, and I go back to my example around breaching the Manukau harbour ponds. Give nature a sniff, and she doesn't need a second go at it. All we're going to do is help her.
I don't know, though. You might have just solved the financing problem. You're proposing a user pays issue. $1 per tree. That's a user pay system.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll have to get a lot of people through our museum to play to Repart New Zealand. Going to be a big museum. Why don't we just make the museum the whole of Aotearoa? And allow people to take the trees away with them. How's that?
Oh, wow. I think we're doing that right now.
Yeah.
So looking out 10, 30 years into the future, where do you see all of this culminating and coming together, where we have nature regeneration, we have natural integration with the infrastructure systems, and what does that look like 30, 50 years from now?
So firstly, I think we need to be more overt about understanding, and then I'll use the word valuing, the resilience services that natural infrastructure is already providing. It's providing them silently. I'm going to say, dare I say, without cost, on a daily basis, and we're living the benefit of it, and we don't really realise that until we've removed or messed with that natural system. I think we need to be more deliberate about how we include natural infrastructure options in our thinking on projects from the outset. I actually think the bigger challenge is how do we get the majority of people within New Zealand and across the world indeed to understand.
Well, that was my next question. What would you say to our listeners to help them make this become a reality?
I think we need to constantly reinforce the notion of system thinking. I think too often we think about individual components within a system. We go and make a change to that component, and then it surprises us that a whole lot of things happen out here. It's this sort of whack-a-mole approach, right? We go and whack-a-mole and something else pops up. To the people on this call, keep bringing your great ideas forward. No one owns the OP. No one knows everything. And, the right solutions will come through sharing of ideas, sharing of experiences, because there are some great examples. We just don't tend to be talking about them. And who knows, maybe AI is going to help us work our way through this. And I'd like to, personally, I'll go with a personal note. I'd like people to start talking about nature regeneration, not nature conservation, because I think the concept of, we're going to put a border around this and keep it, and then anyone who wants to cross that border and we all hell breaks loose because we need to fight for that border. And I'm going, well, we don't need to fight for a border if it's everywhere, right?
Right.
And that's not to use it. That's to make sure that in using it, we're doing it sustainably and we're replacing it and regenerating it. So there we go. There's 3 things. How's that?
That sounds really good. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. I think this was a fantastic conversation, and we were really glad to have you.
Ka kite.
And thank you for listening to Infrastructure Connections. Please take a moment to follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and we want to know what you think. Leave a comment down below to give us your thoughts, or drop us a line at the Infrastructure Sustainability Council. Stay tuned for the next episode of Infrastructure Connections.